This work is somewhat out of date, but I think the reason I want to talk about it is I think there's some useful comments and questions that arise out of its shortcomings and also out of the things that we learned out of it. And this focus is around two sort of ideas that I've developed out of this. They are basically to do with two things I call second nature and also digital wild. I'll try and clarify these a little bit through the work itself, so I can run you through some of those things. What I did about 4 or 5 years ago is I set up together with another person a sort of research venture called Architecture and Urban Research Lab. Through this, we set up a number of sort of research projects. We had various kind of graduate researchers doing a kind of diversity of projects here. We were trying to look at sort of metabolic systems and artificial ecologies, all of these types of things, none of which worked out how we'd anticipated. What we did manage to get happening was a certain kind of diversity of approaches, which was contingent perhaps on the individuals doing these things. They were all trying perhaps to construct sort of synthetic environments that would be able to link, let's say, the determinate, finite, scriptable world of digital technology and cybernetics with the indeterminate in some ways. So all of them have sort of potentials but also limitations in that way. Here, for example, is the sum of various parts of that, which were sort of tested in this very limited gallery situation. My aim for this was that these things would then be able to begin to talk to each other, a little like Usman spoke about in his final project. I sort of imagine this as some kind of very strange zoo where this sort of diverse hybrids between digital and physical technologies and spaces would be able to begin to talk to each other, interfere with each other, and have some kind of dialogue with each other. What in fact happened was not really like that. These things ended up being quite standalone. But out of this, I think there's something else that maybe that I began to think about. One of these was what I termed second nature. Now, second nature can have a number of interpretations. I like it because it sort of refers both to sort of natural complexity in some ways. It could, in these terms, be a sort of environment, in which case this would refer to a sort of augmented environment. In other words, it's not simply purely natural, but it's linked with cybernetic technologies. We use a lot of microprocessors and things like that to enable this type of environment and its different inputs, outputs, feedback mechanisms, and food web to happen. But from this, I think I ended up with a couple of questions. Is this, for example, the default condition of sort of ubiquitous age that the ICU report that Omar spoke about yesterday is referring to on the Internet of Things? Could we then sort of have this default sort of hybrid digital environment as our normal state of being in some ways? Various other people have commented on this. This is sort of second order comment on this, I suppose, by Anne Catherine Hales. But she's trying to also position the default thing in a very the default condition in a very similar way to the ITU is doing also. So here's some of what we did, right? Some of it is sort of breathtaking, it's naivety, but it's sort of quite playful, which I think is a very interesting attribute of these things in some ways. partly because it breaks down some of the sophistication of the digital world in some ways. So, for example, what these guys ended up doing, looking at second nature as environment, I would sort of understand this as being able to, first of all, make this kind of hybrid. Secondly, to be able to understand this as a very particular environmental condition. It has a use by date, right? These lemons are acting as sort of batteries for this musical instrument effectively that is then sequenced through a basic stamp chip. There's about 6 or 7 sensors. If you break the light beam for them falling on the lemons, it will play a different kind of note. So you can play this thing simply by passing your hand across. But I think it's just an example of perhaps second nature, maybe as a type of environment. There is also then, according to my framework here, sort of perhaps you can interpret second nature as a sort of behavioral condition. In this way, it is a sort of learned behavior. It's not a innate, from birth kind of behavior. It's something you... But, and secondly, perhaps it's not a scripted or programmed behavior. Be more open-ended. Perhaps it starts to deal with an emotional condition as a question. Mark Pauline of Survival Research Lab, of course, sort of in his sort of extreme relationship to his machines, has also said that they have to learn from each other in some senses. This is yet another one. It's sort of a kind of dancing arrangement. What happens is through geophones, the vibrations of these things, these sentinels as they're called, move around through very, very simple means. But then they started to affect the participants who were watching this. And then there's another concept, perhaps, that I want to sort of throw in the mix, called digital wild. This is borrowed in part from a forthcoming Leonardo journal edited by Sue Thomas and Dean Grigger, where they sort of postulate something about digital wilderness, or that can we actually start to represent things that are wild. In other words, they're not necessarily constrained through digital means, even if we are bound by scripting, by cause and effect relationships that are in computers. So in this sense, let's say digital wild, could this, for example, become a certain kind of, in which case, by those very parameters that having digital as a sort of ubiquitous on-off condition through its bits seems to limit us to, or being able to only do scripted behaviors within a single object seems to limit us to. And then I think for me that brings up the second issue with this is does technology per se, perhaps it follows on from Usman's comment very well, but does it have to be a sort of means and useful thing? Can there be a kind of uselessness within this as a potential to instigate other kinds of parameters, whether it's different kinds of behaviors or different kind of connections between formally disassociated things? And a sort of third example of this is this thing, which is done through study of, this is by smaller groups, but done through study of glaciers and ice patterns and landscape mechanisms. So each of these sort of took as their sort of starting point some kind of unbounded condition as an environment, and tried to perhaps mimic in some ways, perhaps transform, these things into some sort of environment where we have the possibility of control but also uncontrol. So this mechanism, for example, rotates around, resorts this garden, sucks up these little pellets, organizes them, or randomizes them according to different inputs provided by its little controller mechanism. And then we would also have perhaps digital wild as a behavioral condition. If this is the case, what would an unscripted behavior be? I'm thinking, literally perhaps some kind of jungle-like condition where there is a very, very complex kind of web of relationships between things. Additionally, can kind of sensing and sensory capabilities, this is something that comes back with me, as a sort of feedback in any complex system, you need a sort of a necessary feedback or food web if it's a natural system to generate unpredictability, dependencies between species, for example. And could this have sort of emotional responses to things in the same way we might talk about sentiment in a stock market or something like that. Fourth example of this is this thing whereby another group was looking at the formation of the northern lights or aurora borealis and trying to mimic that in some ways within this apparatus. Of course, it has limitations and problems with this, but they basically wanted to be able to move this cloud around within this table in the same way as a plasma cloud moves above the North Pole and creates sort of northern lights. So they could eventually do this by employing magnetometers that react very finely to your cell phone, for example, alter the slight magnetic field around this cloud and be able to move it around in the table. Finally, sort of just to open this out a bit, because one of the limitations of all of these things were that they were within a very finite condition. They were things in themselves, and then the things that we produced out of this were exhibited in galleries. They weren't necessarily tested in a bigger realm with different audiences, etc., etc. And there was perhaps a sort of self-contained aspect to them. They would run by themselves. They wouldn't necessarily require sort of external human input into this. So just to show a few examples of this, this is the same person that Usman was talking about. This is he's here in ghost form. This is Adam Somler Fisher. He was one of the people in this organization. This is some of his earlier work in this, whereby he started to do these things to take them out, to test them. But he started out with a lot of other aspects that I think are kind of important, but not really clearly represented in some ways. He started out with sort of pseudoscience that he could then employ either on this 3D in the bottom left, or this sort of fake kind of satellite system, and the scientist in the lab coat who's trying to do that as a way to kind of critically comment on the nature of interactivity and the sort of whole positivistic impulse of technology in this way. So here, for example, I'm sorry, these are not working right, but here there's a number of animations of different parts of that work. There are things that go beyond the research institute we set up. There are, for example, the top part is on his three-dimensional screensaver. there is a sort of dancing backpack thing he did, but as well starting to look at user interface of these. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.